David, what do you think it means to be human today? Because increasingly it's not straightforward. People like Feuerbach, Darwin, modern people like Peter Singer would say that there is no distinction, there's no ontological distinction between us and animals. We've evolved by natural selection. And then you've got genetics. The more we study genetics, the more we can see that human genetics and mammalian genetics generally are very, very similar. And then you've got the rise of artificial intelligence, with people saying within 10 to 20 years we'll have artificial intelligence that's capable of learning and being self-conscious. What do you think it is to be human?
I think that's a really good question, because all those things make it difficult. They problematise our sense of what it is to be human. But I still keep going back to a mid-20th century conception of it, a kind of Jean-Paul Sartre conception. Ultimately, what puts us apart from merely animal life is the ability to be free, to make choices, and to make ethical choices. Now that doesn't put us on a completely different ontological level from all of the beings in the universe, but it seems to be a matter of degree, of a very great degree, in terms of our ability to operate a form of reflective self-consciousness that seems to me, although I wouldn't say we're completely different from animals, it makes a really big difference. And our ability to make free choices and to know the good, to make it sound rather kind of platonic, is quite important.
But you say we're free, and Kant, of course, assumes we're free, but today many behavioural psychologists would say freedom is an illusion, that freedom is conditioned by our background. Altruism has genetic advantages in terms of evolutionary success. So if you were trying to defend Kant, or if you were defending freedom, how would you do so today? What's the basis of saying we're free?
It remains difficult, and I think part of me is drawn towards a kind of Humean compatibilist approach to say all those determining factors that lead us to act for a reason are all true, and yet we still retain freedom.
But that's not genuine freedom. It's you think you're free, but in fact you're controlled.
It's a kind of narrowed freedom, I think, and I'm also reminded very much of the kind of Buddhist idea that we are much less free than we think we are. So our phenomenal perception of ourselves as entirely open free agents is actually compromised by all those factors. But that still doesn't, at the actual moment we choose, we still have some ability to go both ways. And people with almost identical profiles and all those ways still choose other things. But huge social pressures on people. There have been in the past the times when it was universally agreed a certain thing, that there were people who would stand up and say something different. Without dissenters, without some sort of free choice, we wouldn't have made ethical and social and moral progress over the centuries in the way that you might argue we have. So I think freedom is more constricted than it perhaps presents itself to consciousness as, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some form of freedom and some in-the-moment ability to have done otherwise.
See, I agree with you. I actually think freedom, the debate of philosophers as to whether we're free or not is illusory. I think we're capable of freedom, but it's an achievement, and it's actually very difficult to achieve, and Buddhism draws on that. I think Christianity does as well, that we have a capacity to free ourselves from our conditioning, but it's very, very hard. Now the question, of course, is, if you accept that, why cannot artificial intelligence have that capacity? In other words, if artificial intelligence can develop consciousness, then advocates of artificial intelligence would say they will be able to develop the same capacity we have, and I'm not quite sure how one would reply to that.
No, and actually I'm fairly relaxed about that in a sense, because I think the first point of your 2 points was if they can. I think it's a much bigger if than we ever think it is. Yeah. I think the depth and complexity and staggering kind of complexity involved in human consciousness is something we're much further away from than I think the optimistic transhumanists would have us believe.
Yeah.
So I think it's a huge way to go. But if we were able to cross those chasms over the time, if humans survived long enough to be able to kind of do that kind of work, then I'm not sure that we need to have an in-principle objective state. It's in principle impossible ever to. It might be possible. I just think it's much, much further away than we perhaps think it is in a popular sense from watching too much science fiction.
I agree, and people say, oh well, we can map the brain waves when you're thinking of your mum or thinking of your house, but that doesn't begin to understand what consciousness is. I think the idea that we are anywhere near understanding consciousness is an illusion. And again, I think it comes back to this point that being self-conscious, being self-aware, knowing yourself, and Apollo's watchword, I think is something that is incredibly sophisticated and is an achievement, but it's not easily achieved. And I think we're light years from understanding what that is. There was a film, Inside Outside, dealing with the emotions. And what is very interesting in that film is what controls the emotions. And there's a sense in which one's in a regress. But the idea that there is some sort of self that is capable of controlling us, which is what Kant, I think, was saying, I think is a very important insight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's very complicated insight. It becomes very complicated in philosophy because, as you know, I'm very interested in particularly early Indian Buddhist philosophy.
Right.
And there's such a rejection of the Hindu idea of the self. And people tend to think because this Brahman, this kind of very strong notion of the self is rejected, that all forms of selfhood are rejected. And actually it's very much more complicated than that. And I think they argue for a provisional, ever-changing self. So they won't argue for absolute rigidity and permanence. Rather, the self is something which is capable of cultivating change over time. And I think the idea you talked about is freedom of something to be earned. It's really relevant. It certainly reminds me that that we move towards it. Sartre calls it trilogy, the roads to freedom. We don't start off in freedom.
No.
We start off being kind of just swept around by our desires, led around by our noses, by what we want and what we're told to want things. And that freedom is more hard-won than initially we can ever imagine it's going to be.
I agree with that, and I think that's very important briefly for education, because I think one of the dangers of modern British education is we're so concerned with the league tables, we're missing out on helping young people to become self-aware, to think about these issues. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about religious education and philosophy in schools is that it precisely provides that sort of opportunity, which too rigid a sort of utilitarian, grad grind in hard times type approach denies. And I worry that some of our education is becoming so preoccupied with results that it's missing that broader aspect out.
I mean, absolutely. That's why, for me, working with undergraduates in the areas of things like philosophy is such a privilege.
Absolutely.
Because you get to meet people who are kind of interesting and interested, and then 3 years later, when they graduate, you get to meet them, and they're often, in many cases, incredibly sophisticated, nuanced thinkers, who you think that's such a distance from that, kind of interesting but kind of unformed young person, and they become kind of such freer in that sense to entertain ideas without committing themselves to them, and kind of investigate them and be really kind of suspicious, and not in a kind of horrible, cynical sense, but suspicious in the sense of what's going on here, what's this about, what would I need, what would it mean to accept this idea. So the idea to entertain ideas without committing to them and see what that would mean is something that utilitarian model of education just says it's not about that, just remember this.
I know.
It's kind of lost through the
and it's denying imagination, denying new thinking, and British education has tended to prize that, and I fear it's being squeezed out. It seems to me we have a large measure of agreement.
Yes, thank you.